Hi, welcome to Constitutional Chats, hosted by me, Janine Turner,
and Kathy Gillespie,
with students
Dakari Chapman,
and me, Tova Kaplan.
Join us as we discuss hot topic issues with constitutional experts. It's sponsored by Constituting America.
Hi, I'm Janine Turner. Welcome to Constitutional Chats with my hat today. We're thrilled you're here. We have a great show. It's going to be so fantastic. I'm turning off my phone. We have a great co-host panel, including your questions. So we're thrilled about that. We are going to be talking about Cato 5 and the Federalist 70. Isn't this fun how we're talking about the Federalist Papers? And we have, backed by popular demand, the oh so fabulous and wonderful and brilliant Professor Joerk Knipprath. So before I introduce everybody, come on in and have a seat. And Aubrey Jackman is going to put up a little, what do we call this? It's not really a survey. It's not really a quiz. It's just sort of to tell us who you are, right, Aubrey? Why don't you explain it and tell them about it, then I'll introduce you.
Yeah, it's just a poll so that we can find out who is with us today, what category you fall in, so that we know how to kind of tailor our show today.
Perfect, perfectly said. And you can scroll up and down. It's donor, press, friend, elementary school, middle school, things of that nature. So we can know how to tailor, as Aubrey said perfectly, tailor our session today toward you. All right, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the fabulous Aubrey because she's going to be talking with you first. Aubrey Jackman is our media director, and she's responsible for all of our fabulous technology. And she is this year's We the Future contest winner for Best STEM. She's born and raised in Utah as the middle of 7 children. A captain with 7 children. What's the fearsome? Lot of that. Had to do it. Sound of Music, in case you didn't know. And she's awesome. She has a beautiful smile. She's so intelligent and brilliant and talented, and she wants to be an athletic coach. And I just see her. I see it, Aubrey. You're at the Olympics, and you are coaching a team, and they're going to win. Aubrey, say hello.
That would be amazing, Janine. I would get you tickets so you can come see the Olympics.
Yay, I want tickets.
Okay, so just to share these poll results so that we all know who's with us today. The largest group with us is 28% of you are parents and grandparents with children, and then 24% are fans. And then it looks like we have 17% friends, 14% donors, and then we have 7% teachers and also 7% of middle and high school students, and then 3% family. So no matter what category you fall into, we are just so glad you're here with us today.
Great. And who is our number one category today again?
Parents and grandparents with children.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. That's always our top category. We're thrilled you're with us. I homeschool, not that you're homeschooling, but everyone's kind of homeschooling with Delta, I guess, sort of. Who knows? I don't know. Anybody knows. But I homeschooled Juliet for, I guess, 7th grade. She was about 10, 11, or 12. Best year of my life. Hers too, I'm sure. All right. Now I'm going to introduce the wonderful, the fabulous Kathy Gillespie, co-president of Constituting America, with whom none of this would be possible. And she puts up with me, which is amazing. She's a dear, kind, wonderful heart, brilliant woman. She was a chief of staff on the Hill for a congressman for decades. She was also she was a commissioner on the President's Commission on White House Fellows, which is very prestigious. And now she's been asked to be one of the only 16 private citizens serving on the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission, and yet another commission, helping organize the celebration of our country's 250th birthday in 2026. The world is a better place when Kathy Gillespie is not only in it, but your friend and then your co-president, because it's like a wing on an eagle, a left wing and a right wing, not making any political analyses here. And I would just be flapping around without Kathy, because it takes 2 wings to get off the ground, and she's the best partner anybody could ever ask for, as well as the fact that our donors are the wind beneath our wings. So Kathy, say hello and tell us about today's sponsor as well.
Oh, well, thank you, Janine. That was just an over the top, very nice introduction and not true at all because
That's so true.
your leadership is what keeps us going forward and all of your hard work. And it's just my honor and pleasure to get to work with you in doing this for the past 11 years and in helping teach the Constitution. But wanted to thank our very special sponsor today is Leanne Damone Broom from Smith Mountain Lake, Virginia. And Leanne has been a great supporter of Constituting America since our very early days, and just this past spring made a very generous donation to Constituting America and wanted to sponsor 2 constitutional chats. And she did one already, and this is her second one for the donation that she made. So Leanne, we are very appreciative of your generous gift and of your sponsorship of our constitutional chats and all the way that you help us spread the word about all that we do. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Kathy. All right, extraordinary panel. And I'm going to introduce our fabulous constitutional scholar, and we will get down to business about the executive branch and where we are today with that and what the Federalists and Anti-Federalists had to say about it. Great study, I think this is. Tova Kaplan, 17. She's got that blur effect behind her today too, huh? It's pretty cool gadget on this Zoom. 17 years old from Chicago, Illinois. We've known her for about 4 years. She is just simply divine. She's a 3-time winner of our We the Future contest for STEM, entrepreneurial project, the marketing plan, as well as public service announcement. She's also our National Youth Director for Constituting America and runs the Youth Advisory Board, which she does like a top CEO of a top 100 company. And we're just so thrilled. She speaks 3 languages, maybe 4 at this point, and wants to be an ambassador to the UN or Secretary of State or, hey, even the president, I say. So Tova Kaplan, we've known you for, I guess, 4 years now. You're so extraordinary. Welcome to the show and say hello.
Thank you so much, Janine. I always love being on here. Again, it's like the highlight of my week. I'm finally in person at school full time. So I'm like in one of the classrooms, but glad I could make time to be here because it is really just such a special thing. And thank you all for joining us.
And Tova, you've been so incredibly diligent. I mean, you have stayed with us through thick and thin through all of these programs. How many have we done now? Are we close to 100, Kathy? And Tova, you've been there for every single one of them. Minus maybe one, but that's it. All right. And you're such a fabulous addition too. You bring class and dignity to everything we do. All right. Jewel and Joerg Gilbert, also extraordinary. You're going to see them clutching Tonys or Academy Awards. And if they want to go to politics, and I don't even know, we could see them as senators, presidents. Hey, these 2 young men can accomplish anything in the world they want to. We've known them for quite a while as well, and we're thrilled they're with us today. Jewel Gilbert is executive producer, and Joerg Gilbert is operations director for Sing for America, a family-based company the brothers co-founded. And Sing for America seeks to show the art of truth and light through live performance, and both are proud We the Future contest winners. I say that because they wrote their bio, and I'm not saying they're proud. They say they're proud, but we're proud of them as well. Sing for America is an actor-run theater company which specializes in semi-professional musicals, private training in the arts, school drama solutions. So if there are any schools out there that need drama solutions, they're the ones for you. And public entertainment events, all while revealing a colorblind world stage. They are recent graduates of Moravian College, where they earned a BA in musical performance and dramatic production. Y'all should read the script of my Broadway musical. I'm going to send it to you and see what you think. So welcome to the show, the extraordinary Jewel and Joerg. Hey, do y'all ever want to run for public office? What should I be projecting for you in that? I mean, we already know there's going to be an Oscar and Tony.
No, my dad did county council. I think that was enough of an experience for me.
Felt like I was right on it with him.
Yeah. But send us that script, Janine. We'd love to read it.
Yeah, I'm going to. I'll send it today.
All right.
Well, we're happy to be here once again and look forward to another riveting conversation.
Thank you for being with us. It is riveting always, especially with Professor Knipprath. Okay, drum roll, please. Professor Knipprath. Are you ready? Professor Knipprath teaches constitutional law, legal history, jurisprudence, and various business law courses at Southwestern Law School in Los Angeles. We've been there. It's super cool and wonderful, especially because He is there. He is the faculty advisor to the Federalist Society and the Christian Legal Society at Southwestern, wonderful organizations. He's one of Constituting America's constitutional scholars and has been writing essays for our 90-day study since our first year in 2010. So for 11 years, he's graciously been writing articles for our oh so fabulous 90-day studies. You should check that out. It's annual. They're all archived on our website, constitutingamerica.org, or if it's easier to remember, americanthing.org. So Professor Knipprath has written more essays for Constituting America than any other essayist has written. He's written, get this, everybody, 116 essays for us through our 10 90-day studies. Professor Knipprath, you're also incredibly enlightening and when you're on the show with us. So we're thrilled that you're here with your expertise and brilliance and just a fabulous ability to communicate the message. So thank you for being here with us.
As always, Janine, it's my pleasure to be here. And I think that picture was taken the first year that I was with you. So it's been a while, yes, and I've enjoyed it.
Well, we're thrilled you're with us, and we can't wait for you now to break down the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist Federalist perspectives of the executive branch, and then we'll pepper you with questions after that, and our audience will have some questions too. Type in your questions so that Kathy, you can tell them where to type them in, but I think they probably already know. But it's not exactly the Q&A, is it, or is it?
Yeah, it is the Q&A.
Oh, thank you, Aubrey. Q&A. All right. So, Professor Knipprath, can't wait to hear it. Go for it.
Okay. Those of you who've read the Constitution may have noted that Article 2, which discusses the presidency, is much shorter, much briefer than Article 1, which discusses Congress, the powers and limitations on Congress. And there's a reason for that, in part because the framers believed that the president's powers need to be flexible. After all, the president was going to be the only person that was going to be around 365 days a year, because Congress only met for very, very brief sessions. The Supreme Court only met for very brief sessions. So the president was going to be around the whole time, and there was going to be a need for considerable flexibility. But what happened then is that, of course, the critics of the Constitution at the time, the opponents of the Constitution, saw this as an invitation to danger. And as the Cato essay points out, there's the danger that a Caesar will arise. And this was, by the way, a common epithet, a Caesarism. Let me get very briefly into the personalities here. Cato is believed to have been Governor George Clinton of New York, who ended up being the chairman of the convention, the state convention. And he was from the upstate area, so he's a political rival of Alexander Hamilton's. And Cato, in some other essays, complains about Caesarism. And it's not clear whether he was referring to George Washington. Historians believe he was probably referring to Alexander Hamilton. So there's a bit of a personal rivalry that's going on between Cato and Hamilton, writing in the Federalist paper. It's not surprising that Hamilton writes the Federalist position, because he was on the executive power and the judicial power, because that was sort of his inclination towards stronger central government, strong executives. So this would be something that he would be very much interested in. The criticism that Cato launches here is that the powers of the president, as I mentioned, are too ill-defined. And what's going to happen here is that what you're going to get is intrigues. You're going to get the usual avarice and lust for power that individuals have, and that's not going to be controlled. It's very interesting, the accusations, if you want to call it that Cato makes here, both about the nature of society and the argument that was sometimes presented that, well, we can rely on the people themselves to deal with this. The criticism that he mentions here about the progress of commercial society begets luxury, the parent of inequality, the foe of virtue, and the enemy to restraint. And ambition, that ambition and voluptuousness aided by flattery will teach magistrates where limits are not explicitly fixed to have separate and distinct interests from the people. Some would say that's a perfect description of current times. And as far as, well, we can solve this simply by by relying on the people. First off, the people don't elect the president. But second, is it because you do not believe that an American can be a tyrant? If this be the case, you rest on a weak basis. Americans are like other men in similar situations. When the manners and opinions of the community are changed by the causes I mentioned before, and your political compact inexplicit, your posterity will find that great power connected with ambition, luxury, and flattery will as readily produce a Caesar, Caligula, Nero, and Domitian in America as the same causes did in the Roman Empire. We are not somehow special because we live on American soil. All right, so here is then, Hamilton needs to deal with this. And these debates are going on before the New York Convention meets, sort of setting the ground and trying to influence the public and the would-be delegates that were going to emerge. And as you can see from the tone, some of this seems to be responsive to the arguments that Cato makes. And Federalist 70 is one of a series of papers that Hamilton produces on the executive. And this one here, he focuses primarily on the need for a unitary executive and tries to answer why there is no danger, or tries to argue that there really is not any danger. Number one, there is the ability to rely on the people because responsibility will be focused. That a unitary executive provides energy, it provides accountability as well. People can't point to each other. And there's a great discussion that he has about the problem of multiple executives, which were suggested by some critics of the Constitution. And the problem, again, really describing a lot of what goes on today, that when you have these multiple executives, these councils, everybody's pointing at each other when something bad happens. Again, very much reminiscent of current events, that A will shift responsibility to B will shift responsibility to C, and he gives examples of this. So the need for, as Hamilton sees it, for a unitary executive, and that whatever danger comes from that, the potential concentration of power, there are two restrictions on that. One is because people will know who is responsible for messes, as Harry Truman said, the buck stops here. And second, that there are explicit powers that are, and limitations on the president's power. Now, I think he's being a little disingenuous on that point, because one of the issues that comes up, and we can talk about during the discussion, is that there are parts in Article 2 that are very much ambiguous and whose content has been determined over time, starting with the experience of the Washington administration. What, after all, does it mean to say the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States? What is this executive power when it is not further defined? All right, so that's the overview I want to give here of the issues: unitary executive versus multiple executives, the advantage of each, and basically where we are today in relation to executive power.
Okay, thank you, Professor Knipprath. It's a lot to think about, isn't it?
Yes, yes.
Because I think they both have their point. I remember, when I wrote all the essays, I wrote essays on every Federalist paper when we launched in 2010. And I remember where he talks about the executive, Hamilton talks about the executive just by nature wouldn't overstep his bounds. Talk to us more, but of course, I don't know. I guess on the one hand, you could say that that's been proven incorrect, that the executive does overstep his bounds. But boy, I really think our checks and balances have worked. I think that the legislative branch, you see that, and unfortunately it's gridlock and people complain, but that gridlock in a way is a check on tyranny, whether it's the president or the legislative branch or the judicial branch. It's everyone sort of, I've been amazed at watching the legislative branch has a pretty good check on the president. And I think it's also amazing we've gone over 200 years without a Napoleon or a military takeover, or at this point, we don't have a dictator, knock wood, right? So it does seem like perhaps Hamilton was correct. I think one of the biggest problems with the executive branch is probably what Cato was saying. And interestingly, they were both New Yorkers. So they were both going to be, just if people for some reason have a little brain freeze and don't remember that Hamilton is from New York and going to be in that convention in New York. I'm sure he was going to be there, right? Or did he not go? He went. Yeah, he was there. I think that it's the executive power, the executive agreements, and the executive what are they called when they with not the executive agreements, the executive with the he can overturn things with his power. The executive
Veto?
No. Come on, everybody. Toby, executive orders. Thank you very much. Executive orders. I think the fact that it was a little, I think that, okay, I'm all over the place, but I think the checks and balances have actually worked. But the vagary, the vagueness of the second branch, Cato was probably right, because things like executive orders have reared their ugly head. And that has given the president a lot of power to be able to, and I don't know that they really wanted it to be this way. And yet the executive orders has been the one aspect of not being specific in the second branch of the government in Article 2. That's been a problem. Would you agree that that's maybe one of the ways? And also, can you elaborate, and these will be my two questions, can you elaborate on having what it would have been like to have had a presidency that wasn't just one person? I'm kind of thinking about that. That might have been kind of interesting. And how would that have worked? But maybe that would have, I don't know. So let's explore the multiple executives aspect, but also the executive order aspect, that the checks and balances really have worked, but the fact that they can do those executive orders because they weren't specific have turned out to be a little bit of a problem. So to me, it kind of looks like both of them are right.
Okay, Janine, you've raised so many issues. We're going to need 2 to 3 hours to cover them.
No, everyone else has to talk. You have 7 minutes.
So I'm going to maybe focus on a couple of them and maybe try to cover several at once here.
I thought it was just 2. I thought it was the executives. If we had more than one executive, what would that look like in the executive orders? But okay. I know it triggered other things for you, so. Because your brain works like that.
It depends upon how you structure the multiple executive. In California, we have a multiple executive, okay? The British government is in effect a multiple executive. So it could have, in fact, it's not impossible for the government to have, under the Constitution, the US government to have moved somewhat in that direction. What do I mean by that? In California, the governor is elected separately from the lieutenant governor, separately from the secretary of state, separately from the attorney general, and so on and so on. So these officials are all constitutional officials who are independent from each other because they all derive their authority from the voters rather than from appointment by the governor, for example. In England, the ministers carry their portfolio by the vote of Parliament. So in that sense, they again are somewhat independent of each other in that cabinet structure. On the other hand, you could have a multiple executive that's a governor and council type model, as was frequent in the early states, or where the agreement of some council is necessary for the governor to be able to act, such as to appoint officers or to make various agreements or to exercise the veto. In the Constitution, the Senate is sometimes seen as having a sort of kind of role of that type in its advisory function, its technical advisory function, in its partial control over the veto, and its partial control over appointment of officers, and the veto, obviously, along with the House of Representatives. Or we could have had like the Roman system or the Spartan system, where you basically have two rulers, two at the same level. Although there was a reason for that, because in both societies, one of them was typically abroad fighting military battles, and the other one was at home to take care of the home front. So it depends upon what the multiple executive model would look like as to whether or not what this would have turned out to be. You can have pretty efficient government in some of those ways. What's, I think, important here is the way that the Article 2 is structured, and the anticipation that the first president is going to be George Washington, and that George Washington, sort of leave it to George. Washington was going to set the tone for the presidency and how the powers of the president were to be exercised. And what Washington did, he was very conscious of this role. In fact, set the tone. There was a lot of constitutional custom that emerged as to what these various powers meant during the Washington administration, regarding the president's removal power, for example, regarding executive orders. Executive orders have been around, since the beginning. So it's not, the content to Article 2 was to be given by experience over time, because we can't provide for every possible circumstance. And again, there are some limited powers. I'm not sure that the system of separation of powers today works as it was envisioned by the framers. And this is due in part to the complexity of society, in part, significant part, due to the growth of the administrative state, which is something that was not anticipated, at least to that degree, which is in some sense a limitation on executive power as well in practice, because they can block what the president does effectively. On the other hand, who controls these people? And that's a serious problem, but they were dealing with what they were familiar with at the time. And so the unitary executive provides that energy when it's needed, that unity, like the head of government in the United States, and provides also to some degree accountability. One of the points, just on the side, and I'll stop with that, the criticisms, this is a frequent criticism, is that the vice president is basically at best superfluous, probably useless, and potentially dangerous, that office of the vice president. And we've, for the entire time of their histories, what do we do with the vice president? What exactly is that person's role? And so, Jefferson basically, for example, just left the vice presidency alone and went off and did his own thing. All right, anyway, that's what
you bring up a lot of great points there to summarize what you said. Now, I'm thinking 1,000 things because of what you said, right? We're triggered a lot that. But it's interesting to talk about how states do it where and this is true in Texas too, but the lieutenant governor is independently elected, and I believe the secretary of state's independently elected. And wouldn't that be interesting to think about? What if, now we had problems with the vice president being independently elected, which is why we changed and amended the Constitution. That just really didn't seem to work. But it would be interesting if the secretary of state were independently elected, or the attorney general were independently, though they're supposed to be a little separate anyway, but still, that's a thought. If some of these people were not appointed, and they were elected, there might be more check and balance within the executive branch. So I think that that's a really fascinating thought. But the other thought that you brought up that I thought is fascinating, is to use the word fascinating a lot, is that they wrote this Article 2 about the executive branch with Washington in mind. And because he was the indispensable man, the man of incredible dignity and character, they trusted him. And so they left it a little vague, partially maybe because they didn't want to slip George out, and you can, but also it would have been interesting if they had written the Article 2 about the executive branch with King George in mind. I think that they might have been a lot more specific within the second Article 2. What do you think about that? Then I'm going to toss it to Tova in like a lightning round 60 seconds response.
You want me to respond to Tova?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you in 60 seconds would have been if they had written the Article 2 with George Washington. I mean, with
King George
III in mind, they
did.
might have put a lot more restrictions in there.
No, they did that, and they did have restrictions that separated. And Hamilton will go into this here in other Federalist papers and other arguments he made, that there were restrictions that were not on the king, such as the restricted veto power, just to throw one out there. But what Hamilton oftentimes did was to compare the powers of King George favorably to the powers that the governor of New York had. According to Hamilton's interpretation, saw the governor of New York as having more powers than King George did. So it was a great sort of argumentative approach by Hamilton to reject the anti-federalist critiques that the president was given too much power under the Constitution.
Okay, so they felt that he was adequately restricted. They just couldn't see what some of these things would do. Okay, Tova, your turn.
Thank you. So I was wondering, could you touch more on why the author chose Cato as a name? Was there any significance, or did he just, we don't know?
This was part of sort of practice, right? The Federalists wrote under the pen name Publius. Another important writer that you've discussed and I've discussed on a prior program, Brutus, right? So what's going on there? First off, using pen names or pseudonyms was sort of a custom at the time. It arose 100 years early out of a necessity to avoid being prosecuted for criminal libel if you were dissenting politically. But by this time, that wasn't the problem. So it was more of a sort of fad or habit. And people would choose the pseudonym oftentimes to suit the occasion. Hamilton wrote in different eras, different things using different pseudonyms to suit the occasion. Well, who are these people? Cato, Brutus, Publius. They're Roman Republican politicians, right? A lot of these were chosen from Plutarch's Lives. And Cato was one of the opponents of Caesar. He was a Roman Republican politician. There was Cato the Elder and Cato the Younger. So there's even more than one Cato involved in all of this. Brutus was the guy who stabbed Caesar. Or one of the guys who stabbed Caesar. So these were Republicans defending, as they saw themselves, Republican virtue, Republican structures against the threat of, tyranny, monarchy, and so on and so forth. And the Federalists tried to rebut that by referring to themselves to a Roman Republican family, which also happened to mean man of the people. So Publius. That was a, sort of habit in sort of 60-second response.
Thank you. And then, so what was Cato's alternative to the Constitution? Or, he really eloquently criticizes the system that the Federalists lay out, but did he have an alternative? Did he support the Articles of Confederation or some other option?
All right, and another excellent question that could, lead to a long answer. Try to keep it brief. Many of the opponents of the Constitution were not necessarily supporters of the Articles of Confederation. Many of them had gone to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, hoping to produce something that would be an alternative to the Articles, but they left early because, or otherwise opposed it, because they didn't like the particulars of the project. Now, Cato being a governor, the states having to surrender powers, there was always sort of a self-interest in not seeing too strong a central government. But we have to, I think, take it at somewhat face value that people like Brutus and Cato here were moderate opponents. And so they had objections to specific parts of the Constitution that they wanted changed and proposed as alternatives. One of the problems was that the Anti-Federalists generally were attacking or challenging parts of the Constitution, but didn't have a coherent alternative. And Hamilton Madison made much hay out of that in their writing, saying, look, we're waiting for you guys to come up with an alternative. And in the meantime, until you can, we're waiting and waiting and waiting. Let's adopt this and then maybe have amendments to the Constitution. in the future.
Got it. Wow, fascinating. I know there's so much we can delve into in such a short time, but I was wondering, how influential did the Anti-Federalist writings actually become, since we hear so much about the Federalist Papers and they, their ideas were so incorporated into our system today. Did the Anti-Federalists have any comparable long-lasting effects in our government? And how do you evaluate that?
Well, the victor writes the history, but also, since the Constitution was approved, the positions of the Federalist Papers are going to be cited, for example, in Supreme Court opinions, more so than the opponents, as a positive influence on how to interpret the Constitution. By the way, a lot of times the two sides didn't disagree about the interpretation of the Constitution or what the Constitution meant. But one side liked it and the other one didn't. So we can oftentimes get a sense of really, yes, okay, this was the original understanding. I tell my students, when I cite to them, quote to them provisions of Federalist paper, Anti-Federalist positions rather, what can they tell us today? What is our system like today? I sometimes say, who seems to have had the better crystal ball? And I'm not saying it's a 100% one way or the other, but a lot of things that the Anti-Federalists warned about Clinton in a couple of paragraphs here, I think has pointed out things that have happened today that they warned against.
And one thing that has just really fascinated me about your talk today is talking about Hamilton and his, optimistic view of executive power, which I guess I just find really interesting, because we tend to imagine him as this like rule busting, anti-conformist or whatever. At least that's how I imagine him. So I just find it really interesting that he put so much faith. I think now people are so pessimistic about the role of government and putting power in a central government. So why did Hamilton develop that opinion? Like what experiences did he have that led him to develop that kind of optimism?
He was generally not very optimistic about human nature, which I think he was somewhat of a believer, not as much as his critics alleged, I think, of a strong government and a strong central government. I don't know exactly to what extent, don't want to get into, one's ideas are shaped by the physical nature of one's brain. I mean, there's some research about that. Don't know about his psychology from his youth or whatever, but his experience was significantly in the executive branch as part of Washington's staff, as a staff officer, as well as a line officer. His role in the administration of the Confederation, particularly in the finance department, and his role in the abortive creation of the Bank of North America. And then he moves later on, of course, into the executive branch, as well as Secretary of the Treasury and so on. So I think his background there influenced his thinking, but perhaps also his thinking shaped where he wanted to be. So it's an interesting question.
Great, thank you. I think my 10 minutes are up, but this was fascinating. So
maybe we should see the musical and maybe they have something to say about it. I don't know.
Thank you, Tova. And of course, I think one of the long-lasting aspects of the Anti-Federalists, and I'm sure Professor Knipprath would agree with this, are the Bill of Rights. The fact that they fought for those Bill of Rights, though they weren't really a new, aspects of them had been in the Magna Carta and things of that nature, but there were some new ones, and I think that probably all their agitation resulted in having that. Though, of course, the Federalists didn't think it was necessary, but whatever, they did it. Okay, we're really glad they did. Jewel and Joerg, you're on.
Oh, so as we've been studying these Anti-Federalists and Federalists, it has been a little bit hard to try to figure out exactly where they're coming from. for some of their ideas. So I'm surprised actually to see their seemingly faith in democracy as opposed to republicanism. In many of their writings, they almost assume the effectiveness and the just like increased virtue of a more democratic system, whereas we spent a lot of time on this show and when we study our founding fathers, really parsing out the importance of republicanism and it as superior to democracy. So I'm wondering, when they say at the same time as arguing for more democratic process, he then says that the people's opinion is mutable. So to me, it seems like a conflict, and maybe that's so could you explain what they really mean, what he's really thinking?
Well, I would interpret that as partly simply intellectual inconsistency, but partly also a matter of terms. When they're talking about, as you mentioned, oftentimes about, hey, you know, we need to have, there are problems here. There's not enough control by the people. They're not talking about a direct democracy as this, you know, people voting directly on legislation, the classic definition of a democratic system. They arguably are voting for greater popular control over the representatives who are going to be making policy. So one of the critiques that, hey, they're not electing the president directly. It's too, the frequency of elections is too infrequent. So there's not enough popular control, but that's still within a Republican structure. There is not necessarily an argument among the Anti-Federalists. Some, yes, they weren't all the same. But there's not necessarily an argument that the franchise ought to be extended to people that were propertyless, for example. So it's more like, okay, one of the principles of republicanism was direct control, frequent elections, rotation in office. In other words, you can't keep running for the same office. But it was not necessarily that everybody gets to vote, or that everybody's going to vote on everything. Now, the concern, this goes back to Plato, of a more democratic or participatory system, is that the people basically are too easily influenced by passion. And the more you extend the right to vote, the more of these people you get in that are going to react to passion and to the flatteries that politicians make of the people, rather than by the substance of what the representatives and politicians are talking about. So in that sense, it's sort of, yeah, we want more popular control, but at the same time, as you said, there's an inconsistency. We're not sure we can really trust the people because they're so easily influenced.
It was there. That was one area, and thank you for answering that. Then the other one was I hear the Federalists often argue from a standpoint of practicality, and I hear the Anti-Federalists often argue from the standpoint of principle. So it's almost as if oftentimes the Anti-Federalists assume that the government will not need to meet outside or inside pressures that could literally cripple it. It's almost as if they assume that it will run, whereas the Federalists are trying to create something that is not assumed to be able to run, but has the ability to run.
Okay, I'm not sure I would agree with that 100%. It is true that in a number of the Federalist Papers, they talk about, one of them, the experience, the best guide, tells us this and this and this. But they also will say that, hey, the reason we put up this system of balancing of powers is because we need something to control the system generally. And we do that because people politicians are inherently power hungry, so ambition must be made to counteract ambition, as Madison phrased it, right? So there's a lot of theory in that as well. In fact, one of the progressive critiques in the early 20th century of the structure that was set up in the Constitution was that it was too mechanical. That was too sort of set out there and not realistic. And in turn, the Anti-Federalists would point to experience and say, you know, it's been human experience over and over and over again that this is what happens when you have an unrestricted executive. And this is what you need to do in order to prevent that. History tells us this. Clinton himself refers to that kind of experience, historically speaking.
I really also enjoy that line about the commercial, a commercial society and begetting luxury. It's so true. Based on a couple of things that we've talked about today, though, do you think that, often it seems like a lot of the excesses in the commercial system are not, they have to also violate some right to extend to be wrong, or to make the things that the Anti-Federalists were worried about, to make them come true. We can normally point to more than just commercialism or luxury. We can normally point to some right being violated as well. Do you think that the Anti-Federalist system, regardless of anything else, would have at least reduced that? Reduce the ability for like the commercial system to trample rights?
Not at all clear about that, because part of the experience of the time was that because there was no stronger central government, the states, what was happening at the states, the corruption of politics and the economic chaos was due to exactly the problems of rights not being observed as a result of excessive majoritarian rule. Now, the issue of inequality that he mentions, right? He's right in a commercial society, but this is something that anthropologists and political theorists have discussed a long time, that you can have perfect or almost perfect equality of possessions in a nomadic society, because there's only so many animals you can have. But the more complex a society gets, the more inherently unequal it gets, because some are able to compete better than others. And the potential for resources is, if not unlimited, certainly more expanded. And in our knowledge society, for example, this is even exacerbated more. Mark Zuckerberg and Steve Jobs and those folks that were in that information technology gained wealth that was, unrealizable probably in even 100 years ago with the old captains of industry, or 150 years ago. So yes, a commercial society creates more inequality than an agricultural society, than a nomadic society. Partly it's built into the system. So I don't know that we can get away from that.
Okay, so we have 2 minutes before we have to go to Kathy, more like 90 seconds. So sorry, Joerg, but let's lightning answers and thanks.
So I'm curious, before Jefferson's presidency, the vice president was the candidate who received the second most votes, correct?
Correct.
Now, the quote that you said about the vice president being almost useless, how do you think that if that remained the status quo would have changed what we have now?
If the vice
presidency was still the candidate who received the second most votes, because right now that would be the polar opposite mind, more or less, that was with you through every step of your presidency.
Yeah, it raised that potential with the development of parties, but the vice president is still selected separately from the president. So you could certainly have barring the faithless elector statutes for the moment, you could have an elector vote for a candidate for president from one party and a vice president from another party. It's still possible. It's unlikely. But the vice president still has an independent constitutional position. But the role of the vice president hasn't changed, constitutionally speaking. Still the president of the Senate, and that's pretty much the only constitutional role that the vice president has, unless the president dies or becomes incapacitated. What might have happened if there had been no development of modern, well, even with the development of modern party system, I suppose, if they left it that way, you would have friction, because the vice president presumably would seek to undermine the president, or would do what Jefferson did when he was elected Adams as vice president, which was basically, as I mentioned earlier, abandon the post and go organize his own political campaigns.
So you don't think it ever would have lasted, really? That
I don't think so.
I don't think it ever could have been what it originally was.
To me, the development of modern political parties made that highly unlikely.
Yeah, I can't argue with that. And then I was just thinking about, this is more of just a kind of wonder question. We have, on our Federalist side, it seems like we have such strong candidates, such strong arguers for what they pursued. You know, if you just look at Hamilton, he was really a never ceasing individual. Do you think that they won based in a large part on who they were, and less so on what they were fighting for, between them and the Anti-Federalists? So if we took our swath of Jefferson, Hamilton, Washington, and put them over to the Anti-Federalists, do you think that they would have convinced the nation to be Anti-Federalist, to have the Anti-Federalist mindset?
I don't think so. I don't think it was driven by personalities. There was a big difference overall in the age. I mean, the Federalists tend to be somewhat younger. But you had powerful politicians. Governor Clinton was a powerful and well-known political figure. You had Governor Randolph in Virginia who was opposed to it. You had Patrick Henry in Virginia opposed to it. You had John Hancock, Sam Adams, Luther Martin, who was a powerful Maryland politician. All these folks that were opposed to the Constitution as it came out of the convention. So I don't think the Anti-Federalists lacked either for intellectual firepower or for political prominence. What I think helped the Federalists was, one, their practical approach to getting the Constitution adopted, of hitting the weakest or most likely to adopt states first and trying to create a snowball effect. And the other, basically what I mentioned earlier, that everyone agreed that something had to be done about some defects in the Articles of Confederation. I don't say everybody. A lot of people agreed to that. They didn't like what happened necessarily, but a lot of people agreed to that. So Madison could keep saying, hey, we're waiting, come up with something else. And besides, if you don't like this, why don't you give it a shot? It's easier to amend the Constitution because you only need 3/4 of the states to approve than it is to amend the Articles, where you require unanimity. So these were big selling points that they had.
Okay, I'm going to toss it to Kathy. Kathy, maybe we'll go a minute or two over so you have a little bit more time. Go for it with our audience questions. Thank you, Jewel and Dorn. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. We have some wonderful audience questions. Frank Brown asks, to what extent did the executive role that Robert Morris performed under the Articles of Confederation shape the framers' intentions for the presidency?
Morris was an influential figure on the side of finance during the Confederation with the Bank of North America, for example, as well as his ability to procure financing, which helped the country in a number of ways during difficult times. He was also influential in relation to the Navy. the formation of the Continental Navy, and more particular, the equipment of privateers, in which he was also an enthusiastic investor. So as an aside, if people ever tell you that it was private people were not supposed to own cannon or anything like that, private people owned warships, so they clearly owned cannon. Beyond that, Morris was a very controversial figure, and I don't know if he ever had the title of President of the Confederation. I just don't remember. But I think where he had a lot of lasting influence was in the Treasury Department and in Hamilton's policies, Hamilton being a protege of Morris, and shaping policy once a new country was formed in relation to the Bank of the United States and sort of the American system of investment and commercial development.
Well, thank you. And then Gary Porter asks, are you aware of any anti-federalist essays that have been quoted in Supreme Court opinions in order to substantiate the justice's argument? I feel like that the Supreme Court does quote Federalist papers. I mean, am I wrong on that, or?
Well, yes, and that's what I tell my students, why when we talk about the Federalist Papers, why they need to learn it, because if they're going to read Supreme Court opinions, they're going to be in there. So
right.
There are, but I cannot point to specific issues now. There were discussions where the Supreme Court justice might set them off one against the other. Would the Supreme Court justice likely say, I'm going to base my decisions on the anti-federalist view? And the answer would be, I would not expect that, because what they're interpreting is the position, is the current Constitution, or the original understanding of the Constitution that was adopted, which is going to be more reflected in the debates in the conventions, as well as in the Federalist Papers.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting question. I never thought of that before. And then Theodore Toberin asks, when and why did the president, federal executive, move his or her focus from defense and international affairs to becoming more the governor of the United States? Is this something relatively recent, or has this existed since Washington? That is, the responsibility of the state executive governor versus the federal executive POTUS.
Sure, and I think that's true significantly because of the entire role of the federal government having shifted more from foreign affairs and war and peace and certain very general domestic matters to much more of what we would call a state police power. Police power had nothing to do with the cops. It was a word that was used to what we call today to regulate. So the role of the president followed that as well. That's become much more like a current governor because the nature of the federal government and the relationship and the structure to the states and the structure of our federalism is I think vastly different today than what it was 200 years ago.
Definitely. And then finally, John Holmes has a question about executive orders, saying executive orders are not to be used except to aid the president in executing laws passed by Congress. However, in fact, they're being used to make law, which Congress lets happen. So why doesn't Congress exercise its check and balance powers to stop this overreach by the president? This is happening in other issues such as declaring war and executing tariffs, neither of which are powers enumerated as belonging to the president, but to Congress.
Wow, that's an excellent observation, and we probably need a few more hours to really fully explore this. So it's correct. And as much in the nature of government, things have changed and have, the nature of bureaucrats and bureaucracies and office holders is to try to increase their power, and that's a common habit. So we see that not only in executive orders, but in executive agreements with foreign countries. The way that war is conducted, basically the obsolescence of treaties. Right? Secretary of State Kerry at one point, former Secretary of State Kerry pointed out, we don't do treaties anymore because it's too difficult to get them through the Senate. So we do agreements. We don't have peace treaties, we have truces. So it's the same thing with executive orders. Now that said, there has been some movement in Congress over time to not restrict, but to channel the way that police or that executive orders can be made or overturned. So there could be ways that Congress has some period of time to act. Congress could always act, but they're politically either locked and impotent, or they just don't really want to deal with it because let the president take the responsibility, let the president deal with this. But there are ways, presidents are limited. If an executive order has been around for quite some time, then the new president cannot as readily overturn the executive order as when it's as one made right at the end of the predecessor's term, for example. So there are restrictions that Congress has put in to try to curtail the president's ability to make and overturn orders. But yes, it is a problem, and it does lead to executive government, as many have observed, including Supreme Court justices in decisions. The structure of our government is one of potential executive strength. And it's whoever the person is that's the office holders will significantly dictate what the scope of executive power is going to be. The one restriction on that seems to be the bureaucracy.
Well, thank you for that. That was a great summation of executive orders. And we've done a few chats on executive orders as well. And I can send John, I can send you a link after this to some chats that we've done on this subject. But Janine, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, yeah, executive orders is a pet peeve of mine, and I think that I did not know. I knew Congress could always overturn them, and so are executive agreements. The fact that they never do treaties anymore, they can be run through the Senate. Very sneaky and duplicitous way of bypassing our and the Congress has kind of given the president that leeway because they're lazy and don't want to go through all the treaties. It's very, very dangerous. They lose power when legislature keeps acquiescing to the branch. But I didn't know that an executive order after a certain amount of years, they couldn't really overturn.
No, they still can.
I thought the legislature could always overturn an executive order.
The legislature can, but the new administration has to follow certain procedures. They can't just, come in and just overturn on the first day. There are time delays. There are, various steps that have to be taken.
Really? Wouldn't know that. I mean, they go in there and certainly overturn things. It seemed like it's kind of deep pockets this last time.
Some of them, yes. It depends on the nature of the executive order that is being overturned. Yes.
Yeah, fascinating. That's all really interesting. And in closing, when you talked about the whether the vice presidency didn't have any power, and I've been thinking about this over the course of this. And I was thinking about the comparison of Rome and how they had the four different, sometimes they had two leaders. You say one was on the front and one was home, but then they also had two underneath them. But they were equal in power, the Augustus or, the rulers. And they fought all the time, and they were cantankerous and always fought one another. And that's how Constantine, for an example, became, you just took him on and took him down to finally he was the sole emperor of everything. And I guess in a way it's good that our VP doesn't have a lot of power, because I think that would be too tempting to try to take the other one down all the time. That's just my closing thought on that process. I mean, imagine if it were Biden and Trump right now. I think that'd be really interesting.
Well, we have that experience, Jefferson and Adams.
Yeah, that didn't go very well. But if they had more power, it'd kind of be a problem, don't you think?
Yeah, quite so.
But as you said, if the Secretary of State, if people underneath, can you close with just saying in California, you said the lieutenant governors independently is not appointed, and is the secretary of state's not appointed. Who are the four in California that are not appointed?
There are quite a few. The treasurer, the controller, the school board types. I mean, it's quite a bit, quite a few.
But I mean, did you say it was the secretary of
State, the attorney general, the controller, the treasurer.
Yeah. So if we were to parallel that, the secretary of state and the attorney general and the VP, if some of these positions weren't appointed by the president, I think that would have helped us, wouldn't it have?
Well, the Secretary of State in California is different from obviously the U.S. Secretary of State because California doesn't engage in foreign relations. But
well, but you said Secretary
of State in California. The Secretary of State in California deals with voting and things, documents, and so on and so forth. But to give you a quick example of the problem, in some years back, there was a Republican lieutenant governor and a Democratic governor, and the Democrat leaves the state, and the Republican lieutenant governor starts making policy. So that created, the kind of friction that would result from if you had this what you're describing at the national level.
Yeah, thought for it. It's all fuel for thought, isn't it? Professor Knipprath, you're always, always, always sublime and wonderful. And thank you so much for being with us again today.
Again, thank you for having me.
And thank you, Tova, who I think had to go to school, and Jewel and Joerg, who are always amazing, and Kathy's always amazing, and Aubrey, and all of you for joining us. And Kathy, tell them what's next week.
Well, next week, we are going to have Professor Gordon Lloyd on with us. And I wish that I had the topic in front of me, but I have somehow fallen down on the job, and I'm not looking at the schedule. So if Jewel and Joerg want to say their goodbyes and come back to me, I'll have it up in just one quick minute.
Thank you for the conversation again today, Professor. I always learn so much when we go back to this topic, because it's something that we don't really study too much in school. We learn about that it happened, but we learn more about the Federalist position. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, you did a great job answering our questions, and
yeah, thank you for
I
being
learned
very
a lot
direct.
today.
Yeah, very direct, and don't like
you guys always ask good questions.
Yeah.
Kathy, I found it. Did you find it too?
I did. Am I on mute? No. Yeah, do you want to read it? Or it's next week is the powers of the new government, Brutus 5, Agrippa 7, and Federalist 45.
There we go. You don't want to miss that.
No.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Professor Knipprath, as always. Thank you.